Looking back now, 30 years later, I still get chills thinking about that Sunday evening. I was 11 years old when my stubborn defiance led to an encounter that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Even now, as I write this in my study, my hands tremble at the memories that flood back. The heavy wooden door closed behind my mother with that familiar creak, followed by the click of the lock engaging. Her footsteps faded down the concrete steps of our old Victorian house, and for the first time in my young life, I was completely alone at home. The setting sun cast long shadows through the windows, stretching across our living room floor like grasping fingers. "Remember to lock all the doors, Michael," she had warned, her face stern with disapproval at my claimed stomach ache. "And don't forget your prayers just because you're not coming to evening service." There was something in her eyes then, not just disappointment, but fear. Looking back, I wonder if she knew something, if she had felt the wrongness that permeated our house even before that night. I waited by the window, watching her black dress disappear into the growing dusk, before jumping onto the couch with the kind of reckless abandon only a young boy could muster. The whole house to myself. No hymns, no uncomfortable wooden pews, no stern looks from Mrs. Henderson when I couldn't sit still during the evening sermon. I remember thinking how clever I was, how I had managed to fool everyone with my fake illness. Our house was different in the evening light. The familiar rooms took on an otherworldly quality as shadows crept across the walls. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway, a family heirloom that had kept perfect time for generations, suddenly stopped at 6:66, an impossible time that made my stomach lurch when I noticed it. I blinked and the hands moved to 7:07, but I knew what I had seen. The first hour passed with deceptive peace. I was sprawled on the living room floor, surrounded by comic books I wasn't usually allowed to read on Sundays, when I heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from the kitchen. My first thought was our cat, Shadow, except Shadow had been missing for 3 days now. The last time I had seen him, he had been staring fixedly at the corner of my bedroom, his fur standing on end, before darting under my bed and disappearing entirely. The scratching grew louder, more deliberate, like fingernails on wood. In the dimming light, shadows seemed to dance along the walls, and I swear I could see faces forming in the darkness, twisted, grimacing faces that vanished when I tried to look at them directly. I muted the TV and held my breath, listening. The sound stopped. Then, just as I was about to relax, a cabinet door slammed shut with such force that I nearly jumped out of my skin. My heart began to race as another cabinet banged open and closed, then another, and another, like invisible hands were searching for something. The silverware drawer flew open with a crash, and I heard our utensils beginning to rattle and clink against each other. Not just random movement, it sounded almost like they were being sorted through, examined. The sound of metal scraping against metal filled the kitchen. In the growing darkness, each metallic scrape seemed to echo through the house, building to a crescendo that made my teeth ache. That's when I noticed the first truly impossible thing. The kitchen chairs had begun to arrange themselves around the table, as if invisible guests were preparing for a meal. One chair pulled out with a slow scrape against the floor, then another, and another. I could hear the wood creaking as unseen weights settled into them. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The temperature in the room suddenly dropped, and I could see my breath forming little clouds in the air. That's when I noticed the smell, like old meat and wet earth, the same smell that had wafted from old Mr. Peterson's open casket at his viewing the week before. The smell grew stronger, and with it came another scent, the sickly sweet odor of funeral flowers. The rattling stopped abruptly, and in the silence that followed, I heard something that made my blood run cold, the soft pat-pat-pat of wet footsteps coming from the kitchen. They were heading toward the living room, toward me, but before they reached me, something even more terrifying happened. I heard the sound of chewing. Whatever was in our kitchen was eating something, making wet, slobbering sounds that no human mouth should make. I finally managed to break free from my paralysis and ran upstairs to my bedroom, slamming the door behind me and diving under my blanket. But the blanket couldn't block out the sounds that followed. Heavy breathing just outside my door, the doorknob slowly turning, the floorboards creaking under weight that shouldn't be there, and worse. I could hear singing now, a distant, distorted version of the hymns that would be playing at the evening service. Through the thin fabric of my blanket I saw my bedroom door open. The wet footsteps entered my room, leaving dark, glistening marks on the wooden floor that gleamed in the faint streetlight filtering through my window. They stopped at the foot of my bed. Something dripped onto the floor with a heavy splash. I squeezed my eyes shut and began reciting the prayers I should have been saying in church, my voice cracking with terror, barely above a whisper. The temperature dropped even further and I felt something cold and wet touch the blanket right above my foot. The wet thing began to move up my leg, leaving a trail of moisture that soaked through the blanket. That's when I heard old Mr. Peterson's voice, exactly as it had sounded in life when he led the choir, except now it was distorted, as if he were speaking through a mouthful of dirt. "Forsaking the assembly of the righteous is a sin, boy." The blanket was suddenly torn away, and I found myself staring into the face of something that had once been my elderly neighbor. His skin was gray and waterlogged, his suit stained with grave dirt, and his mouth was full of silverware, forks and spoons protruding between his teeth like metal fangs. Water dripped constantly from his clothes, forming puddles on my bedroom floor. I screamed then, a sound of pure terror that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside me. Suddenly, every cross and religious icon in my room crashed to the floor simultaneously. The thing that had been Mr. Peterson withdrew and I heard it retreat with quick, angry steps. The cabinet doors in the kitchen began slamming again, this time with such violence that I could hear hinges breaking and wood splintering. But it wasn't over. As I lay there, paralyzed with fear, I heard more footsteps joining the first set, dozens of them, all moving around downstairs. The sound of chairs scraping on the floor grew louder, and above it all, I could hear the mumbling of prayers spoken by voices thick with dirt and decay. They were having their own service right there in my kitchen. The temperature continued to drop until frost began forming on my windows. The hymn singing grew louder, but wrong. The words were backward, the melody discordant. I could hear silverware clinking like a parody of communion, and beneath it all, the sound of chewing continued. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. When my mother finally returned home 3 hours later, she found me still under the blanket, shivering in the darkness. The kitchen was devastated. Every cabinet door hung askew or lay broken on the floor. Our silverware was scattered everywhere, some pieces bent at impossible angles, others bearing what looked like teeth marks. Dark, wet footprints led from the kitchen to my room, but they ended abruptly at my bedroom door. The chairs were arranged in a perfect circle around the kitchen table, each one wet as if someone soaking wet had been sitting in them. On the walls, water stains formed what looked like faces, their mouths open in eternal screams. As my mother held me trying to make sense of what had happened, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the kitchen table, our utensils had been arranged to spell out 3 words: "Go to church." Below this message, smaller pieces of silverware spelled out, "Next time we take you with us." That night, as we stayed at my aunt's house while my father boarded up our broken cabinets, we heard the news. The body of old Mr. Peterson, our neighbor who had died the previous week, had been found disturbed in his grave. His casket was empty, and there were muddy footprints leading away from the cemetery, heading in the direction of our house. But that wasn't all. 5 other graves had been found disturbed as well, all of them belonging to former church members known for their perfect attendance records. They say he had been our town's most devoted churchgoer for 60 years, never missing a single Sunday service, not even once. The same was true for all the others whose graves were empty. In life they had been the pillars of our congregation. In death it seemed they had appointed themselves its enforcers. I'm a grown man now, with children of my own. Every Sunday evening, without fail, I take them to church. They sometimes ask why I'm so strict about attendance, why I insist even when they're feeling under the weather. I've never told them the real reason. How could I explain that somewhere out there, something is still watching, waiting for another chance to teach a lesson about Sunday obligations? But sometimes on quiet nights I swear I can still hear the sound of wet footsteps in my dreams, and I wake up to the faint smell of old meat and wet earth. And on rare occasions when I pass by the kitchen late at night, I catch a glimpse of water stains forming on the wall, arranging themselves into familiar faces, faces I remember from old church photographs, their mouths filled with silverware, waiting to welcome another member to their congregation. The worst part? Last week my teenage son tried to fake a stomach ache to skip evening service. As I insisted he get dressed for church, I noticed something that made my heart stop. There were wet footprints leading to his bedroom door, and the faint sound of hymns drifting up from our kitchen. Some lessons, it seems, must be taught generation after generation, and those who would enforce them never truly rest in peace.